The night before Vivian's wedding, the air shimmered with joy and laughter. The rehearsal dinner glowed beneath a crystal chandelier that scattered rainbow lights across the room. Vivian stood near the piano, practicing her vows aloud. Her voice soft but full of excitement. Her golden hair framed a face glowing with love, and her blue eyes shone like morning dew. Everyone watched with admiration. Everyone except her soon-to-be husband, Adam, whose smile carried more calculation than care. He leaned close, whispered something in her ear, and she giggled before glancing toward her mother. That was when Grace felt it, the cold twist of unease deep inside her chest. After the rehearsal ended, Adam approached with that polished grin that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Parker," he said smoothly, "could we talk in private for a moment?" Grace followed him into the library, her heels clicking across the polished wood floor. The smell of brandy and cedar hung in the air. When the door shut behind them, Adam's charm vanished like mist. "Let's skip the pleasantries," he said. "It's time we were honest about tomorrow." Grace folded her arms. "Go on then." Adam poured himself a drink, his hand steady now. "Vivian and I are starting a new life. Clean slate, no baggage." He took a sip and turned toward her. "And that means you." Grace blinked, uncertain she'd heard him right. "I'm sorry," she asked quietly. Adam's smile sharpened. "We don't want you around anymore." Vivian agrees. "You've been too controlling, too involved. It's time you disappear from our lives permanently." The words hit like a slap. "Disappear," she repeated, her voice trembling. "You think that's a gift?" He shrugged and finished his drink. "You love giving presents. Consider this your final one. Make the right choice tomorrow, or Vivian will have to choose between us. And trust me, she won't choose you." Then he left her standing in the stillness, her reflection trembling in the dark glass behind him. That night, Grace sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by shadows and memories. On the table before her lay the deed to her lakeside home, the same house Vivian had adored since childhood. It had always been her daughter's favorite place, full of summers, laughter, and sunlight over calm water. Vivian believed it was her wedding gift, already showing it off to friends online with captions like "Our forever home." But the deed was still in Grace's name alone. Adam didn't know that the house he coveted would soon become his downfall. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and opened her laptop, her hands no longer shaking. "If he wants me gone," she murmured, "then I'll give him exactly that." She typed an email to her real estate agent. "List the lake house immediately. Price to sell fast. I'll explain later." One click, and Adam's dream evaporated into cyberspace. Then she picked up her phone and began making calls. "Helen, it's Grace Parker," she said to the caterer. "I need to add something to tomorrow's reception. White envelopes at every table." "Yes, I'll bring them in the morning." When Helen asked what was inside, Grace smiled faintly. "Wedding favors," she said softly. "Very personal wedding favors." By dawn, the house smelled of coffee and determination. Grace sat at her kitchen counter sealing the last white envelope with care. 67 of them, one for each guest expected at the reception. She paused for a moment, staring at the stack like a general reviewing her battle plan. Vivian's envelope was different. Inside it lay a printed copy of the real estate listing showing the lake house sold that very morning. The others contained something far more explosive. For months, Grace had quietly collected information about Adam: bank statements, legal notices, and failed ventures hidden behind his charming smile. She remembered the stories he told at dinner, bragging about investments that never happened, about companies that supposedly existed but had no records online. Grace had spent sleepless nights verifying every detail, discovering the truth behind his smooth lies. The man about to marry her daughter wasn't a successful entrepreneur. He was a con artist living off borrowed charm and other people's money. Now every guest at that wedding would read the truth in black and white. Grace stacked the envelopes neatly in a white box, tied it with a ribbon and whispered, "Happy wedding day, Adam." At sunrise, she dressed carefully in a pale blue suit and pearls. Her reflection in the mirror showed calm strength, not vengeance. She loaded the box into her car and drove to the venue, the country club where her family had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries for years. The October air was crisp, the kind that made flowers bloom brighter and cameras love every shot. Helen, the caterer, met her at the service door, coffee cup in hand. "Morning, Grace," she said, eyeing the box suspiciously. "You've got me curious. What's in there?" Grace smiled lightly. "Let's just say it'll make today unforgettable." Helen chuckled, taking the box. "You've never struck me as the secretive type." Grace leaned closer. "You'll understand by tonight. One envelope at every table, just like I described. Don't open them. Trust me." Helen nodded, still confused but loyal after catering dozens of Parker family events. "You're the boss, honey." Grace thanked her and stepped outside. For a moment, she looked at the decorated garden, the flower arches, the silk ribbons, the place where Vivian would walk toward a man who had deceived them all. A pang of sadness touched her heart, but she brushed it aside. "Better one broken heart now than a lifetime of regret," she whispered. Later that morning, Grace joined Vivian and her bridesmaids at the salon. The air smelled of hairspray, perfume, and laughter. Vivian looked radiant in her silk robe, nervously twisting the engagement ring on her finger. "Mom, I can't believe this is really happening," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "What if something goes wrong?" Grace squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Sweetheart, sometimes things go wrong for the right reasons." Vivian laughed softly, brushing it off as nerves. "You're so dramatic, Mom." Grace smiled, hiding the ache behind her calm eyes. "Maybe. But someday you'll thank me for it." By mid-afternoon, guests began to arrive at the garden ceremony. The sky was flawless blue, and soft music drifted through the air. Vivian looked breathtaking in her grandmother's lace gown, every step slow and graceful as she walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm. Grace sat in the front row, her heart pounding beneath her pearls. When she saw Adam waiting at the altar, smiling like a man who believed he had won, she took a slow, steady breath. The minister's voice echoed. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today," Grace whispered to herself, "dearly deceived." The ceremony unfolded beautifully. There were no interruptions, no objections. When Adam kissed his bride, the crowd applauded, unaware that the world around them was seconds away from collapsing. Vivian's face glowed with joy, her hand resting trustingly in his. Grace forced herself to smile and clap along, though her fingers trembled slightly. "Enjoy your moment," she murmured. "It's your last lie in peace." When they walked down the aisle together, Vivian turned and blew her mother a kiss, the same way she used to as a little girl leaving for school. Grace caught it with a weak smile, tears pricking at her eyes. Inside the reception hall, laughter and camera flashes filled the room. Guests mingled by the buffet, drinks sparkled in crystal glasses, and a violin quartet played something light and romantic. Grace moved quietly between tables, making sure the decorations were perfect. The envelopes Helen had placed earlier blended beautifully with the decor, white on white, innocent and unread. "Margaret, this looks amazing," said Aunt Dora, holding a glass of champagne. "Vivian and Adam are such a lovely couple." Grace smiled politely. "Yes, they are for now." When dinner was ready, the MC took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin this special meal, the bride's mother has left a small gift at every table, an appreciation note from the Parker family." Applause followed. Grace lifted her glass and watched as 67 pairs of hands reached for 67 envelopes. The sound of paper tearing filled the room like a quiet storm. A heartbeat later came the first gasp, from Adam's college friend at table 3. Then a sharp intake of breath from table 5. And then the whispers began. Grace didn't move. She simply sipped her champagne and waited for the truth to detonate. Adam noticed the change in the air. His confident smile faltered as his eyes swept the room. Guests stared down at the papers, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. One man stood up, waving his envelope. Adam, you told me you'd pay me back last spring. What's this? Another voice shouted from across the hall. You scammed us, man. Panic flickered in Adam's eyes as murmurs turned to confrontation. Vivian's face drained of color. What's happening? She whispered. Grace set her glass down, folded her hands, and met Adam's gaze across the room. Her smile was calm. The storm had begun. Vivian, one of her bridesmaids, murmured. People look angry. Before she could respond, Adam's friend stormed toward their table, red-faced and furious. You owe me $12,000, he shouted, waving the papers in Adam's face. You lied about that investment. Vivian froze, her fork clattering onto her plate. Investment? She asked, turning to Adam. Another guest stood up, then another. He owes me too. He borrowed from me. The room exploded in noise, accusation, and betrayal. Grace sat still, watching as years of deception unraveled before everyone's eyes. Adam stood abruptly, his practiced charm crumbling. Everyone calm down. This is some kind of misunderstanding. His voice cracked. Vivian, sweetheart, I can explain. But she cut him off. Explain what? She cried, her voice echoing across the room. Why people are saying you stole from them. Why they're holding proof with your name on it. Grace reached into her purse and drew out a folded document. Maybe this will help, she said, sliding it across the table. Vivian unfolded it, her hands trembling. It was the lake house listing, sold that morning for cash. Vivian's eyes widened. You sold it, she whispered. Mom, you sold our wedding gift. Grace looked straight into her daughter's eyes. It was never yours, Vivian. It was mine. And I sold it before it could become another one of his lies. Adam's face flushed with fury. You did this, he hissed at Grace. You're ruining everything. She shook her head calmly. No, Adam. You ruined yourself. All around them, guests were on their phones, taking photos, calling lawyers, whispering to one another. The music had stopped. The fairy tale was over. Vivian, Grace said softly, your husband asked me to disappear from your life. He said it was your idea. Her daughter's face went pale. What? That's not true. I never said that. Adam reached for her hand, desperate. Baby, don't listen to her. She's trying to turn you against me. Vivian pulled her hand away, her voice trembling. Did you say that to my mother? Did you? Adam hesitated. And that hesitation told the truth before words could. Vivian stepped back, tears welling in her eyes. Oh my God, you did. The room fell silent as an older man, Judge Morrison, a family friend, stood from his seat. Son, your lies end here, he said firmly, holding up his own envelope. Your father's firm disowned you for embezzlement 18 months ago. It's right here in black and white. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Adam's shoulders sagged, the mask finally breaking. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and somewhere, the violinist quietly packed away his bow. Grace lifted her champagne glass again, her voice calm and clear. You wanted me gone, Adam. Congratulations. I'm disappearing, just not the way you planned. By the time the police arrived, the reception hall looked nothing like a celebration. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned, and the wedding cake remained untouched beneath the glittering lights. Guests huddled in corners, whispering and comparing the documents from their envelopes. Vivian sat in her chair, motionless, mascara streaking her cheeks. Adam paced near the bar, his voice rising with desperation. You're all overreacting, he shouted. Those papers are fake. But the crowd didn't believe him. Too many stories matched. Too many victims stood in that same room, staring at the man they once trusted. A uniformed officer approached Grace quietly. Ma'am, we've received several complaints of fraud. We'll need statements from anyone involved. Grace nodded and handed over a folder from her purse. Everything you need is in here. Records, transfers, statements. You'll find more than enough to prove what he's done. The officer took it carefully, impressed by her calm tone. Vivian looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, how long have you known?" Grace turned to her, eyes soft but steady. "Long enough to make sure you were safe." Adam tried one last time to salvage his image. "Vivian, you can't believe her," he said, taking a step toward her. "She's jealous. She's always wanted to control you." Vivian shook her head slowly. "You lied to me, Adam. About your work, your family, your money. About everything." He tried to reach for her again, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me." The firmness in her voice silenced him. For the first time, Adam seemed to realize the power he'd lost. The girl who once defended him was now looking at him like a stranger. When Detective Morrison entered the room, his badge glinting under the chandelier, the whispers quieted. "Mr. Adam Brooks," he announced, "you're under investigation for multiple counts of fraud and theft." Gasps echoed as the detective read his rights. Adam's face drained of color. "You can't arrest me in the middle of my wedding," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Actually," the detective replied calmly, "this is exactly when you should be arrested. Everyone you've wronged is already here." A murmur of grim satisfaction passed through the guests as handcuffs clicked into place. Vivian covered her mouth, watching the man she thought she loved being led away in front of family and friends. Grace wanted to reach out to her daughter to comfort her, but she knew Vivian needed to see the truth without interference. When Adam was finally escorted outside, the hall fell eerily quiet. The violinist stood in the corner, unsure whether to continue playing or leave. Grace exhaled slowly, the tension of months lifting from her chest. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." Detective Morrison returned a few minutes later and approached their table. "Mrs. Parker, we'll need you to come by the station tomorrow to give a full statement." Grace nodded. "Of course, Detective." Vivian finally spoke, her voice small. "Is he going to jail?" Morrison nodded. "He will. The evidence you provided is solid. He's been running cons for years. You saved more people than you know." Vivian looked down at her trembling hands. "I thought he loved me." Grace touched her shoulder gently. "Con men always make people believe that, sweetheart. That's how they survive." Later that night, when most guests had gone and the police had finished their work, Grace found Vivian sitting alone near the dance floor. The room smelled of wilted roses and extinguished candles. Her daughter's white dress was rumpled, and her hair had fallen loose, framing a face heavy with disbelief. "I can't believe I didn't see it," Vivian whispered. "All the signs were there, and I just ignored them." Grace sat beside her. "You wanted to believe in love. There's no shame in that. But love isn't blind, Vivian. It just looks away sometimes until it hurts enough to see." Vivian turned to her mother, tears spilling freely now. "How did you stay so calm through all this?" Grace smiled faintly. "Because I've already lived through worse. When your father died, I learned that strength doesn't mean not breaking, it means standing up again after you do. Tonight, I just refused to fall." Vivian nodded slowly, her eyes searching her mother's face for the woman she used to overlook. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said finally. "I should have trusted you. I should have listened." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "It's all right. You're listening now." The country club staff began clearing tables, sweeping confetti and rose petals into silver bins. Outside, the night had grown quiet, the moon reflected over the still lake that had once belonged to Grace. Vivian followed her mother to the parking lot, shivering slightly in the cool air. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Grace opened the car door and looked at her daughter. "Now we start over. You come home. We heal, we rebuild, and maybe, just maybe, you'll learn to trust your instincts again." Vivian managed a small smile. "And if I can't?" Grace smiled back. "Then you borrow mine until you can." As they drove away, the lights of the country club faded behind them. Vivian stared out the window, her reflection pale against the glass. "You know," she said quietly, "you really did disappear, didn't you? Just not the way he wanted." Grace glanced at her and nodded. Sometimes disappearing means becoming someone they can't touch anymore. They drove in silence for a while, the sound of the tires steady against the road. For the first time in months, Grace felt peace. A quiet, satisfying peace that came from knowing the truth had finally spoken louder than every lie. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Grace brewed 2 cups of coffee. Vivian sat at the table, still wearing her mother's robe, staring blankly at the steam rising from her cup. The silence between them was gentle, not awkward, like 2 people relearning how to breathe together. "I called the station," Grace said softly. "They confirmed Adams being charged with fraud and conspiracy." Vivian nodded slowly, her voice fragile. "It feels like a nightmare I haven't woken up from." Grace sat across from her. "It will feel that way for a while. But it's over now." A knock at the door interrupted them. On the porch stood David Cole, the private investigator Grace had quietly hired months ago. His face was calm, his brown coat dusted with morning dew. "Mrs. Parker," he greeted, holding a folder. "I thought you should have the final report." Vivian looked up nervously as Grace invited him in. "Everything you suspected was true," David said, laying out photos and documents on the table. "Adam's scams go back years. Different towns, different names. You weren't his first mark. But thanks to you, you'll probably be his last." Vivian swallowed hard, flipping through the pages that showed bank transfers, false identities, and written statements from other victims. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered. "He knew exactly what to say," Grace replied. "He watched you, learned your hopes, your fears, and made himself into whatever you wanted to see. That's not your failure, Vivian, it's his crime." Vivian's eyes filled with tears. "I thought he loved me." Grace reached over, brushing her hand gently. "You mistook manipulation for affection. It happens to the best of us." David packed up the papers, giving Grace a reassuring nod. "He'll serve time," he said firmly. "You exposed something much bigger than one con artist. You saved other families too." When he left, the kitchen fell quiet again. Vivian leaned back, rubbing her temples. "What am I supposed to do now? My job, my apartment, everything was tied to him." Grace smiled softly. "You start fresh. Move back home for a while. Rebuild your life on your own terms. You don't have to rush to fix everything in one day." Vivian sighed. "I just feel empty." "That emptiness," Grace said, "isn't a curse, it's space for something better." Vivian looked at her mother, really looked this time, and saw not just a parent but a woman who had stood against humiliation, betrayal, and pain without losing her grace. "I don't know how you did it," she said. "I barely made it through last night." Grace chuckled quietly. "You'll learn. Strength doesn't come from never breaking. It comes from knowing you'll heal after you do." For the first time, Vivian smiled through her tears. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot." Grace nodded. "I have. And I survived every bit of it." Later that afternoon, Vivian sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket while Grace watered her garden. The world felt quieter now, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Birds sang again, and somewhere down the street, children laughed. "Mom," Vivian said suddenly, "I think I want to help people like me. People who got tricked by someone they loved." Grace turned off the hose and looked up. "You'd be good at that." Vivian nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I could start a blog or an outreach group. Something to warn others before it's too late." Grace's eyes softened. "Then do it, sweetheart. Turn what hurt you into something that helps someone else." That evening, they lit candles in the living room, a small ritual to mark a new beginning. The news played quietly in the background. Reports of Adam's arrest, his connection to other fraud cases across several states. Vivian watched without flinching. "It's strange," she said, "seeing him on TV like that. Just another headline." Grace handed her a cup of tea. "That's all he ever was, a headline waiting to happen. But you're more than that, Vivian. You're a story still being written." Vivian smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes softening. And you're the one who taught me to write it. A week later, they returned to the country club to collect the few belongings left from the wedding. The staff greeted them kindly, though awkwardly, unsure what to say after the chaos of that night. As they walked through the empty hall, Grace paused beneath the same chandelier where it all began. "Funny," she murmured. "I thought this light made everything look perfect." Vivian looked up too. "It still does," she said softly. "But now I know perfection can be blinding." Grace smiled. "And truth can be bright enough to see by." They shared a small laugh, the first real one in days. That evening, Grace watched Vivian unpack her things back into her old bedroom. The walls still held photographs from childhood, reminders of simpler days before heartbreak and betrayal. Vivian paused, holding one photo, her father and Grace by the lake house years ago. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think that house was my dream. But now I realize my dream was never the place. It was the peace that came with it." Grace smiled, touched by her daughter's clarity. "Then you'll build that peace wherever you go." Vivian turned, eyes shimmering. "Together?" Grace nodded. "Always." That night, as the moonlight spilled across the living room floor, Grace sat by the window with a cup of tea. Vivian slept soundly in her old room, safe for the first time in months. The world outside was calm, and for once, so was she. Grace thought of Adam's words, "You should disappear." She smiled faintly. "I did disappear," she whispered. "Just not the way you meant." Instead of fading, she had risen, stronger, wiser, and surrounded by truth. The mother who was told to vanish had found her voice again, and in saving her daughter, she'd rediscovered herself. The real wedding gift, after all, was freedom.